Central California Women's Facility, known inside the system simply as CCWF, does not announce its danger loudly. There are no towering stone walls meant to intimidate the public, no cinematic clatter of iron gates echoing through a medieval corridor. Instead, the threat here is quieter, institutional, and constant. It lives in routine. It lives in proximity. And on the day this story begins, it lives inside a single housing unit, where hundreds of women are confined together under fluorescent lights that never quite let the mind rest. CCWF sits outside the town of Chowchilla, California, a flat stretch of land where heat lingers and dust settles into concrete. As the largest women's prison in the United States, it was built to manage scale, thousands of inmates, multiple security levels, sprawling housing units designed for efficiency rather than humanity. That design choice matters. Because what happens inside this facility is shaped less by chaos than by compression, too many people, too little space, and no meaningful way to escape one another. The housing unit at the center of this documentary is not a segregation wing or a disciplinary unit. It is a general population dorm-style housing block, a place where women sleep in rows of bunks, store their lives in plastic bins, and conduct every aspect of existence within sight and sound of others. Privacy does not exist here. Neither does silence. By policy, this unit is governed by routines that rarely change. Morning count. Breakfast movement. Yard release. Program call-outs. Afternoon lockdowns. Evening count. Lights dim but never fully off. Each movement is supervised, timed, and recorded. Yet within those rigid structures, an informal order exists, one enforced not by correctional officers, but by inmates themselves. Power inside women's prisons operates differently than many outsiders expect. It is less overtly violent than in men's facilities, but no less dangerous. Control is exercised through alliances, intimidation, exclusion, and sudden retaliation. Debts are tracked mentally. Disrespect is remembered. Rumors move faster than staff. And when tensions rise, they do so slowly, invisibly, until they erupt. In this unit, the pressure had been building for weeks. Overcrowding was not new. CCWF has struggled with population density for years, often housing far more inmates than originally intended. Bunks were packed tightly, leaving narrow aisles between beds. Lockers overlapped. Common areas became contested territory. Something as small as where someone sat during count or which shower stall they used could become a provocation. Racial and social groupings, though less rigid than in men's prisons, still shaped daily life. Women gravitated toward those who shared language, background, or sentence length. Long-term inmates exerted quiet authority over newer arrivals. Those without affiliations learned quickly to keep their heads down, to avoid eye contact, to move with purpose and neutrality. Correctional officers assigned to the unit rotated regularly. Some were experienced, others new. Staffing shortages meant officers were often responsible for more inmates than policy recommended. Surveillance existed, but attention was stretched thin. Cameras did not capture everything. And even when they did, response time mattered. Inside the unit, whispers had begun to circulate. A disagreement over personal property. Accusations of theft. A perceived insult that traveled through intermediaries, changing shape as it moved. No formal complaint was filed. No staff intervention occurred. From an administrative standpoint, the unit appeared stable. It was not. Women who lived there sensed the shift. The air felt heavier. Conversations stopped abruptly when certain inmates approached. Small confrontations flared and were quickly suppressed, not resolved, just postponed. Experienced inmates recognized the signs, the tightening circles, the testing glances, the deliberate invasions of personal space. One inmate, central to the incident that would soon unfold, had developed a reputation for asserting dominance within the unit. Not through constant violence, but through unpredictability. She was known to confront perceived slights directly, to demand acknowledgement, to enforce her own version of respect. Others avoided her when possible. Some aligned with her. A few resented her. The woman who would become her target occupied a more vulnerable position. Less connected. Less protected. She had attempted to navigate the unit quietly, but quietness in prison is often misread as weakness. Whether intentionally or not, she became entangled in the conflict that had been brewing, pulled into a situation where retreat was no longer possible. On the day of the assault, the unit followed its normal schedule. There was no announcement, no lockdown, no warning broadcast over the loudspeaker. Inmates moved between bunks and tables. Some prepared for yard release. Others remained inside, reading, talking, waiting. Correctional staff conducted routine checks. From their perspective, nothing appeared out of order. No alarms sounded. No emergency codes were called. But tension does not require noise to exist. In the moments leading up to the assault, witnesses would later describe a subtle shift. A confrontation that began as words, low, controlled, meant to be heard only by those nearby. Body language changed. Distance closed. The space between bunks, already narrow, became a corridor with no exit. This is the dangerous reality of dorm-style housing. When violence erupts, there is nowhere to run. No cell door to close. No barrier to create separation. Inmates are forced to choose instantly, intervene, flee, or freeze. The women around them sensed what was about to happen. Some stepped back. Others looked away. In prison, survival often depends on knowing when not to see. What occurred next would become one of the documented inmate-on-inmate assaults at CCWF, recorded in incident reports, investigated internally, and later referenced in disciplinary proceedings. It was not random. It was the result of accumulated pressure inside a system designed to contain bodies, not diffuse conflict. As Chapter 2 will reveal, the individuals involved did not arrive at this moment by chance. Their histories, positions within the unit, and the unspoken rules governing CCWF all converged here, inside this single housing block, under artificial light, with no audience beyond those trapped within the same walls. This was not a riot. It was not a spectacle. It was a focused act of institutional violence, brief, intense, and devastating for those involved. And it began long before the first blow was thrown. Chapter 2, Inside the Unit, Female Hierarchies, Pressure, and the Path to Violence. Inside a female housing unit at Central California Women's Facility, power is rarely announced. It is inferred, tested, and enforced through repetition. Unlike the rigid gang structures more commonly associated with men's prisons, women's prison hierarchies are fluid on the surface and volatile underneath. They are built on reputation, emotional leverage, and a constant evaluation of who can be pressured, and who cannot. By the time this incident reached its breaking point, the female inmates inside this unit already understood who held influence and who did not. That understanding did not come from official status. It came from observation. The dominant female inmate at the center of this assault was not the loudest person in the unit. She did not need to be. Her authority came from her history, years already served, prior disciplinary write-ups that marked her as someone unafraid of consequences, and a pattern of confrontations that ended with others backing down. She had learned the prison's most important lesson: violence did not need to be constant to be effective. It only needed to be remembered. Other female inmates adjusted their behavior accordingly. They altered walking paths to avoid crossing her line of sight. They chose different tables. They kept conversations short when she was nearby. None of this was written down. None of it was ordered. But it was understood. The woman who would later be assaulted occupied a different position within the same female housing unit. She was not new to incarceration, but she was new to this particular environment. Transfers into CCWF often place women into housing units where social dynamics are already established. There is no orientation for the unwritten rules. You learn them through correction, or punishment. She did not align herself quickly. She did not seek protection. She attempted to exist quietly, to minimize her footprint. In a crowded female dorm-style unit, that strategy can backfire. Silence is sometimes interpreted as defiance. Neutrality can be mistaken for disrespect. The conflict that escalated between these two female inmates did not begin as violence. It began as friction. A missing item. An accusation passed through a third party. A comment overheard and repeated out of context. Each interaction layered new meaning onto the last, until the original cause no longer mattered. What mattered was perception. In women's prisons, perceived disrespect can be as dangerous as a physical threat. Being seen as someone who can be challenged without response invites escalation. The dominant female inmate believed her authority inside the unit had been questioned. Whether that belief was accurate was irrelevant. In prison logic, belief alone is sufficient justification. Other female inmates noticed the shift. Conversations involving the two women grew shorter and sharper. The dominant inmate began positioning herself closer during count, during meals, during idle periods inside the unit. Space was invaded deliberately. Each step forward was a test. Correctional staff did not intervene, not because they were negligent, but because nothing had crossed a disciplinary threshold. No physical contact. No raised voices. No direct threats that could be formally documented. This is one of the most dangerous gaps in institutional control, the space between policy and reality. Inside the female housing unit, inmates understand exactly how far they can push before staff must respond. They also understand how to operate below that line. The assaulted woman attempted to de-escalate in the only ways available to her. She avoided confrontation. She limited movement. She stayed near groups when possible. But avoidance in a dorm-style female unit is temporary. Eventually, paths cross. On the day of the assault, witnesses would later describe a sense of inevitability. The dominant female inmate had been unusually focused. Her movements were deliberate. Her attention fixed. She was not pacing. She was not agitated. She was resolved. Several female inmates later stated they recognized the signs. They had seen them before in other units, other prisons. When someone stops posturing and starts positioning, the decision has already been made. The assaulted woman did not fully grasp what was unfolding until it was too late. When the verbal confrontation began, it appeared similar to previous exchanges, quiet, controlled, contained. But the tone was different. There was no testing this time. There was no negotiation. The physical layout of the female housing unit played a critical role. Bunks created blind spots. Tables restricted movement. The density of bodies limited escape routes. When violence erupted, it did so in a space that offered no margin for error. Other female inmates reacted instinctively. Some backed away immediately. Others froze. A few shouted warnings that came seconds too late. No one intervened physically. In women's prisons, stepping into someone else's conflict can make you the next target. This is not indifference. It is survival. By the time correctional officers responded, the situation had already escalated beyond verbal confrontation. What followed would be documented as a severe inmate-on-inmate assault, one that resulted in injuries, disciplinary action, and long-term consequences for both women involved. But the roots of that violence lie here, in the slow formation of hierarchy, the misinterpretation of silence, and the institutional conditions that allow pressure to build unchecked. What follows occurred inside the same female housing unit at Central California Women's Facility, under the same fluorescent lights, between the same rows of bunks described in the earlier chapters. No new location. No shift in setting. Only a rapid collapse of control. The assault did not begin with chaos. It began with stillness. In the minutes before physical violence, the female inmates closest to the two women sensed a change in energy. Movement slowed. Conversations trailed off. The dominant female inmate positioned herself deliberately, closing distance without raising her voice. Her posture was upright, her shoulders squared. She was not pacing. She was not posturing. She was committed. The targeted female inmate stood near her assigned bunk. She had limited space behind her and other female inmates to either side. The layout of the dorm, metal bunks aligned in rows, created a narrow channel that restricted movement. This mattered. In a cell, a door can be shut. In a dorm, there is nowhere to retreat. Minute 1. The verbal exchange began quietly. Words were exchanged at close range, low enough to avoid immediate staff attention. Other female inmates looked away, not out of ignorance, but out of instinct. In prison, witnessing the wrong moment can carry consequences. The dominant female inmate stepped closer. The space between them closed completely. This was no longer a conversation. It was a confrontation. Minute 2. Physical contact began abruptly. The dominant female inmate initiated the assault without warning. There was no escalation phase, no prolonged argument. One moment there were words, the next, there was force. The targeted female inmate attempted to shield herself, raising her arms instinctively. Nearby female inmates reacted immediately, some backing away, others freezing in place. A few shouted for officers, their voices sharp but uncertain. In a dorm-style female unit, sound travels quickly, but response does not always match speed. Minute 3. The struggle intensified. The two female inmates collided with the edge of a bunk, metal rattling against metal. The confined space magnified every movement. There was no room to circle, no way to create distance. The dominant female inmate pressed forward relentlessly, using proximity as a weapon. The assaulted female inmate attempted to break free, but her footing was compromised by personal belongings stored beneath the bunk. Balance mattered here. In confined institutional spaces, losing balance often means losing control. Minute 4. Other female inmates began to retreat further, forming an involuntary perimeter. No one intervened physically. This is not uncommon in women's prisons. Intervention can transform a two-person conflict into a multi-inmate incident, dramatically increasing consequences for everyone involved. Correctional officers were alerted. A call was made. But distance and procedure matter. Officers must assess before entering a volatile situation. In the seconds it takes to move, violence can already peak. Minute 5. The assaulted female inmate fell to the floor. The dominant female inmate remained standing, her movements aggressive and focused. The encounter was brief but intense. This was not uncontrolled rage. It was targeted, deliberate, and driven by perceived necessity within the inmate social code. Shouts grew louder. The sound of boots approached. The presence of authority was imminent. Minute 6. Correctional officers entered the female housing unit. Commands were issued loudly and repeatedly. The dominant female inmate disengaged only after direct orders were given. Resistance at this point would have compounded consequences. Officers separated the two female inmates, placing physical barriers between them. Other female inmates were ordered to their bunks. Compliance was immediate. Everyone understood the shift. The informal order had given way to institutional control. Minute 7. Medical staff were called. The assaulted female inmate was assessed on-site before being escorted out of the unit. The dominant female inmate was restrained and removed separately. The remaining female inmates stood silently beside their bunks, eyes forward. The unit was placed on lockdown. Minute 8 and beyond. What lingered was not noise, but aftermath. Silence returned quickly, heavier than before. The assault had been brief, but its impact would last far longer. The social structure inside the female housing unit had shifted again. Power had been asserted, but at a cost. In official documentation, the incident would be summarized in clinical language: time, location, participants, response. But those documents do not capture what the female inmates felt in those minutes: the sudden realization that proximity can turn fatal, that routine can fracture without warning. This is the reality of institutional violence in women's prisons. It is rarely prolonged. It is rarely chaotic. It is precise, compressed, and devastating in its efficiency. The moment correctional officers secured control, the female housing unit shifted into a different state of existence. The noise stopped. Movement ceased. And the institutional response, precise, procedural, and unforgiving, took over. A lockdown was declared. Inside this female housing unit, lockdown did not mean evacuation or isolation. It meant confinement in place. Every female inmate was ordered to stand by her bunk, hands visible, eyes forward. The dorm's open layout, which had amplified danger minutes earlier, now amplified compliance. There were no doors to close, no corners to hide in. Authority was immediate and absolute. The assaulted female inmate was escorted out first. Medical staff moved quickly but quietly, assessing injuries without commentary. Her removal left an absence that felt heavier than her presence had been. In prison, visibility equals vulnerability. Being taken out marks you, whether as victim, witness, or future problem. The remaining female inmates understood this instinctively. The dominant female inmate followed, restrained and separated. Her exit altered the unit's internal balance. Power vacuums form quickly in confined environments, but not during lockdown. During lockdown, no one moves to fill them. Everyone waits. Correctional officers conducted a rapid sweep. They scanned bunks, checked hands, verified counts. Questions were minimal. Statements would come later. Right now, control mattered more than context. For the female inmates left behind, time stretched. Lockdown suspends routine, and routine is how people survive incarceration. Without it, thoughts turn inward. Eyes track small movements. Every sound feels amplified. Fear did not manifest as panic. It manifested as stillness. Some female inmates replayed the assault in their minds, dissecting every second. Others avoided thinking about it entirely. Both reactions are common. In women's prisons, emotional processing happens quietly, internally, because outward expression can be misinterpreted as weakness. The unit smelled faintly of disinfectant by the time officers finished securing the area. The bunk where the assault occurred was stripped of loose items. Bedding was removed. Personal property was bagged for review. These actions were procedural, but they sent a clear message: this space is no longer neutral. Rumors began forming immediately, even in silence. They would later circulate in fragments: who started it, who said what, who would be written up, who would be transferred. None of that information was available yet. But uncertainty is its own form of punishment. Correctional staff maintained presence longer than usual. Their posture was alert, watchful. In women's facilities, staff are trained to expect emotional aftershocks following violence, retaliation, breakdowns, sudden outbursts. None came. The female housing unit remained subdued. Eventually, inmates were allowed to sit. Then, hours later, limited movement resumed under supervision. But the unit did not return to normal. It never does. The assaulted female inmate would not return to that dorm. Medical separation and administrative review ensured that. The dominant female inmate faced disciplinary proceedings that could alter her custody level, housing assignment, or sentence conditions. Consequences were already unfolding, even if they were not yet visible. For everyone else, the aftermath settled into memory. In women's prisons, violence often reshapes social terrain more subtly than in men's facilities. There was no celebration, no overt claiming of status. Instead, boundaries tightened. Conversations grew cautious. Neutral spaces became charged. The bunk aisle where the assault occurred became a place people avoided without discussing why. This is how institutional violence endures, not through repetition, but through imprint. By the end of the day, CCWF's administrative machinery had done what it always does, documented the incident, stabilized the unit, and moved forward. On paper, the situation was resolved. Inside the female housing unit, it was not. Chapter 5 will examine what followed beyond lockdown, disciplinary outcomes, institutional consequences, and the long-term impact of a single assault inside one women's prison, on those directly involved, and on the system that allowed it to happen.